Forget the marble aqueducts and the grand forums. Cast aside the romanticized tales of lawgivers and philosophers. That is the polished facade Rome presented to the world, a narrative meticulously crafted over centuries. But beneath that veneer, a far grimmer truth festered, a systematic brutality rarely spoken of, yet etched into the very foundations of the empire. For Rome, mere conquest was never enough. Death for a vanquished enemy was often a mercy. What they truly craved, what they meticulously engineered, was the complete, soul-shattering destruction of dignity. Imagine being torn from a throne where you were revered as a living deity, a commander of armies, a ruler of nations. Picture your royal robes stripped away, your sacred symbols desecrated. Then envision yourself dragged through the very streets of the city that celebrates your downfall, your suffering transformed into public entertainment.
This was the dark heart of ancient Rome, a practice history books often gloss over or simply ignore. This is the story of queens, women who once commanded entire civilizations, reduced to human trophies, paraded like exotic animals, humiliated before bloodthirsty crowds, ravenous for glory. The official history paints Rome as the bastion of civilization, the fount of law and order, the mother of Western culture. School texts drone on about roads and Roman law, about the Pax Romana, as if it were a benevolent gift to conquered peoples. But there was another Rome, a Rome meticulously documented by ancient historians, only to be later edited, softened, and whitewashed. Yet the documents endure. They lie hidden in the chronicles of Livy, the meticulous records of Plutarch, the vivid descriptions of Appian. And what these texts unveil is a machine of systematic humiliation, precise and ritualistic in its cruelty. When Rome conquered a kingdom, killing the royal family was insufficient.
That could grant them a swift, honorable end. Rome demanded more. It needed to shatter the myth, to profane the divine, to transform the sacred into the grotesque. According to records salvaged from the Library of Alexandria before its fiery destruction, and later painstakingly copied by medieval scribes, captured queens were considered the ultimate prize of any military campaign. They were not mere prisoners of war. They were living symbols of entire civilizations, the personifications of the very power Rome had so decisively subjugated. And precisely because of this, their treatment had to be exemplary. Exemplary in the most brutal sense of the word. These ancient documents speak of golden chains, of shackles specifically crafted for these occasions, because even humiliation had to possess a certain style. It had to be aesthetically perfect for the spectacle that was to unfold. Let us begin at the very start, the capture.
Imagine you are Cleopatra Selene, daughter of the legendary Cleopatra of Egypt and Mark Antony. You grew up amidst marble palaces and fragrant gardens, tutored by Greek philosophers, mastering 6 languages, studying astronomy and medicine. You are considered a living divinity, a direct descendant of the gods. And then, in a single day, everything collapses. Octavian's legions swarm Alexandria. Your mother and father choose their own tragic end. You are 10 years old, and Roman soldiers enter your chambers, not with swords, but with chains, for you are worth more alive, far more valuable as a spectacle. Plutarch's records describe how royal children captured after the Battle of Actium were kept in conditions that alternated between calculated comfort and psychological terror, preparing them for what lay ahead. What lay ahead was the triumph, Rome's most sacred ceremony, the pinnacle of military celebration. For a general to be granted a legitimate triumph recognized by the Senate and the people, he needed specific ingredients. He had to have conquered significant foreign territory, killed at least 5,000 enemy combatants in battle, and crucially, captured members of the enemy royalty for public display. Without these, there was no triumph, merely a common, forgettable victory. This is why queens were so immensely valuable. They transformed a military campaign into eternal glory. The preparation for a triumph spanned months. During this time, the captured queens existed in a strange limbo, neither truly alive nor dead, neither free nor completely enslaved. They were fed, clothed, and kept healthy, yet they were also studied, observed, and prepared. Scribes diligently noted their habits, their perceived weaknesses, their reactions to fear. Every detail would later be leveraged on the day of the spectacle.
According to chronicles preserved in the Capitoline archives, unearthed by Italian archaeologists in the 19th century, specific officials were responsible for training the royal captives for the parade. Yes, training, as one might train an animal for a circus. The queens had to learn to walk in chains without stumbling, to maintain their balance after hours of marching, to endure the scorching Roman summer sun without collapsing prematurely. And then the day would arrive, the day all of Rome paused to watch. Imagine a city of 1 million inhabitants, every street adorned, every temple open, incense perfuming every corner. The procession began at the Campus Martius, snaked through the Circus Flaminius, and ascended the sacred way to the Capitoline Hill. It could last 6, 7, even 8 hours. And throughout this agonizing ordeal, the captured queen would be there, at the heart of the spectacle, but never alone. Rome was sophisticated in its cruelty.
The queen marched surrounded by elements carefully chosen to maximize her humiliation. First came the treasures plundered from her kingdom, statues of her gods, crowns of her ancestors, jewels from her palace, all piled onto wagons, openly displayed as spoils of war. Next, vivid paintings and sculptures depicted her defeats, her cities in flames, her soldiers being massacred. Artists were commissioned months in advance to create these representations. The more graphic, the better. And then finally came she, the queen. But in what form? Descriptions vary depending on the general and the occasion, yet documented patterns emerge. Cleopatra Selene, daughter of the last pharaoh of Egypt, was paraded in chains alongside her twin siblings, Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, behind giant effigies of their deceased mother. 10 years old, walking beneath the August sun, while the crowd screamed insults in Latin she barely comprehended.
Julius Caesar, in his quadruple triumph of 46 BCE, exhibited Arsinoe IV, Cleopatra's sister, in golden chains so heavy she could barely walk. Appian, a 2nd century Greek historian, mentions that the sight of Arsinoe, a young Egyptian princess stumbling under the weight of her chains as tears streamed down her face, provoked an unexpected reaction in the Roman crowd. Usually hardened to such spectacles, murmurs of discomfort arose. Some even called for her release, but the procession did not stop. It never did. Can you truly fathom what must pass through the mind of a woman in this situation? You, who once commanded armies, managed treasuries, and held the power of life and death, now dragged like a circus animal, pelted with spit and insults, beneath the gaze of hundreds of thousands who celebrate your defeat as the greatest gift from the gods.
Each step is an agony, not only physical,
Though the chains tear at the skin, the sun causes burns, and dehydration blurs the vision, but primarily psychological. For you know this will not end. You know that even if you survive the parade, even if the victorious general decides to spare your life, you will never again be who you were. Your name, your dynasty, your kingdom, everything has been transformed into a cruel joke, a mere trophy, a footnote in the sprawling glory of Rome. And the refinements of cruelty continued. Zenobia, the formidable queen of Palmyra, who in 272 CE dared to challenge Rome and almost forged an independent empire in the east, was captured by Emperor Aurelian after a brutal siege. Byzantine historians, compiling older sources, describe her triumph in Rome with details that still cause unease today. Zenobia was not merely chained. Her chains were so heavy that slaves had to help her carry them.
Chains of gore, adorned with the very jewels she had once worn as a queen. A perfect inversion. What had been a symbol of power now became an instrument of profound humiliation. She was forced to walk for miles, not in her royal attire, but in rags that parodied her former splendor. The crowd adored such details. The crueler the inversion, the more satisfying the spectacle. But the parade was only the first part. Something far worse awaited at the end of the Sacred Way, the Mamertine prison. A subterranean dungeon in the heart of Rome. A fetid cavern carved into the living rock, so ancient that the Romans themselves did not know when it was built. And it was there, in that dark, damp hole, that many of the captured queens spent their final moments. For while some were spared, kept alive as exotic curiosities, or married to Roman nobles to seal alliances, many others were ritually executed after the triumph. The execution occurred far from public eyes, yet everyone knew.
It was part of the script. The general would ascend to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline, offer sacrifices to the gods, and give thanks for his victory. And all the while, deep below, in the Mamertine, the executioner did his work. Strangulation, swift, efficient, silent. The queen, who just hours before had been the center of Rome's entire attention, died alone, in the dark, forgotten even before her last breath. Jugurtha, king of Numidia, though not a queen, his fate illustrates the pattern well. After being displayed in the triumph of Gaius Marius in 104 BCE, he was cast into the Mamertine. The guards tore off his clothes, including the gold earrings he wore, with such violence that parts of his ears were ripped away. He lasted 6 days in that hole before dying of starvation and cold. According to Sallust, the Roman historian who documented the Jugurthine Wars, his last words were a bitter joke about how cold the Roman baths were.
Even in death, Rome demanded its enemies be reduced to anecdotes. Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who nearly defeated Julius Caesar, spent 6 years imprisoned before being paraded in Caesar's triumph and then executed. 6 years in a cell, knowing precisely what his fate would be, simply waiting. This too was part of the punishment. The agonizing anticipation, the chilling knowledge that you existed merely as a prop for another man's glory. And when that day finally arrived, when you were dragged into the sunlight for the first time in years, pale, weakened, barely able to walk, the crowd saw precisely what Rome intended them to see. Not a dignified warrior, not a courageous leader, but a pathetic specter, a hollow shadow of what you once were. The humiliation continued to operate even after death, because the stories survived. Rome made sure they survived. But some queens met a different destiny, and in a way a worse one, because death, however humiliating, was still an end.
For some, there was no end, only a transformation into something else. Cleopatra Selene, whom we mentioned earlier, survived. She was kept in Rome, educated as a Roman, and eventually married to Juba I, a client king of Mauritania. On the surface, this appears to be an act of mercy. She became queen again, had children, lived in a palace. But consider what this truly meant. It meant she spent the rest of her life governing a puppet kingdom, married to a man chosen by her captors, raising children who would be taught to serve Rome, perpetuating the very system that had destroyed her family and her civilization. It meant she had to swallow her rage, her grief, her identity, and feign gratitude because the alternative was the Mamertine. This type of humiliation is more sophisticated, more complete, more total than any public execution. It is the death of who you are, allowing your body to continue living. Rome was explicit about this.
It was no accident. It was calculated policy. A letter preserved in the imperial archives of Constantinople, penned by an advisor to Augustus, openly discusses the utility of keeping certain captured queens alive. Death makes martyrs, the text states, but life on our terms makes allies, and if not allies, at least living examples of our mercy. Do you perceive the perversion? Rome's supposed mercy in sparing a life was in truth another form of cruelty, more refined, more enduring. You lived, yes, but as living proof that resisting Rome was futile, as a demonstration that even the most powerful, even the divine, could be domesticated. There was also a deeply disturbing sexual element to this calculated domination. Though ancient sources tread carefully in their descriptions, Rome invariably saw itself as masculine, virile, and conquering. The peoples it subdued were cast as feminine, passive, to be penetrated.
This metaphor was never subtle. It permeated Roman art, literature, and political discourse. And when Rome captured a literal queen, a woman of immense power, the opportunity to make this metaphor devastatingly literal often proved irresistible. The records rarely offer explicit details, yet enough oblique references exist for modern historians to deduce the grim reality. Captured queens were frequently described as having been tamed, broken, or made soft. These were euphemisms understood by all. The queen's body, much like the body of the kingdom she represented, had to be subjugated, possessed, and indelibly marked as Roman property. Consider the tragedy of Boudica, queen of the Iceni in Britannia. She was never captured, choosing death before the legions could reach her. But we know precisely why she rebelled in the first place.
According to Tacitus, the most detailed historian of her revolt, after King Prasutagus, Boudica's husband, died, the Romans moved to annex his kingdom. As part of this process, Roman officials invaded the royal palace, publicly flogged Boudica, and violently assaulted her two daughters. When a queen dared to protest such treatment, she was bound and whipped before her own people. Her daughters were violated in front of her very eyes. This was no mere excess of undisciplined soldiers. It was a deliberate policy. It was the Roman way of demonstrating that the old hierarchies were dead, that there was no longer any native royalty, only subjects of Rome. And if a queen failed to grasp this fundamental truth, she would be taught it in the most brutal way imaginable. Boudica responded with unparalleled fury. She rallied her armies, utterly destroyed Roman colonies, and slaughtered 70,000 Romans and their allies.
For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed possible that Britannia might indeed cast off the legions. But Rome never forgave, never forgot. The Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus marshaled his forces,
confronted Boudica in open battle and annihilated her army. And when Roman victory was absolute, when all hope was extinguished, Boudica drank poison. She chose death over capture, death over becoming a trophy, death over being dragged through the streets of Rome, death over being transformed into a cruel joke. Tacitus writes about her choice with something akin to respect. Even the Romans, it seems, understood the profound dignity in such a decision. Yet they also ensured that Boudica's kingdom was utterly destroyed after her death, her temples burned, her name forever associated with defeat and tragedy. This was the pattern. Other queens made the same agonizing choice.
When Antiochus X invaded Egypt in 170 BCE, Cleopatra, facing imminent capture, attempted to take her own life. She failed and was captured, but managed to negotiate terms before she could be sent to Rome. The threat of being paraded as a trophy was so terrifying that even Roman conquerors occasionally recoiled from it, using it as a powerful negotiation tool. Accept our terms or face the triumph. It worked. Almost always, it worked. But why did Rome engage in such ritualistic cruelty? What was the ultimate purpose of inflicting such profound degradation? Was it not enough to win the war, to seize territory, to exact tribute, to install puppet governors? Why was it deemed necessary to destroy not only the political body of the enemy, but also its very soul, its dignity, its humanity? The answer lies deep within the very nature of Roman power. Rome was not merely an empire, it was an idea. The idea that there was one singular, correct form of civilization, one superior culture, one manifest destiny for all of humanity. And this idea had to be constantly reaffirmed, continually demonstrated, perpetually spectacularized. The triumph was not just a celebration of military victory, it was a religious ritual, a cosmological affirmation, a profound demonstration that Rome favored Rome above all other peoples. For this ritual to truly function, for it to be utterly convincing, the representatives of the conquered peoples had to be completely, utterly humiliated. Because if a captured queen somehow maintained her dignity, if she died with courage, if she faced Rome with defiance burning in her eyes, that would contaminate the carefully constructed narrative.
It would subtly suggest that perhaps Rome was not so superior after all, that perhaps other cultures also possessed intrinsic worth, that perhaps conquest was nothing more than brute force, and certainly not divine destiny. Therefore, the humiliation had to be total. Queens were stripped of their sacred symbols, chained like common criminals, dragged for agonizing hours under the blistering sun, forced to witness the destruction of everything they held dear, and then either executed in silence or transformed into collaborators for the very system that had destroyed them. Every single element was precisely calculated to break not just the person, but everything the person represented. And it worked. Rome endured for centuries. Its system of domination, its terrifying machine of humiliation, proved incredibly effective at maintaining control over vast territories and diverse populations. Terror worked. Spectacle worked. Ritualistic cruelty worked.
The German historian Theodor Mommsen, writing in the 19th century, attempted to argue that much of this was exaggeration, that ancient sources tended to dramatize, that Rome was, in fact, quite civilized by the standards of its era. But the more documents are unearthed, the more archaeological discoveries are made, the clearer it becomes that the ancient descriptions were, if anything, understated. Rome was precisely as brutal as Tacitus and Appian described, possibly even more so, because the sources that survived were all written by Romans or by people writing under Roman domination. Imagine what the sources that were deliberately destroyed might have revealed. Imagine the stories the captured queens themselves might have told, had anyone cared enough to preserve their voices. This brings us to a deeply uncomfortable question. We today still revere Rome. We study Latin in our schools. We admire aqueducts in museums. We watch films that romanticize legions and emperors.
Our own governmental architecture often imitates Roman temples. Our concepts of law derive from Roman jurisprudence. When politicians seek to sound profound, they quote Cicero and Seneca. Rome is ubiquitous in our culture, consistently presented as the very foundation of Western civilization, as a model of order and progress. But Rome was built upon mountains of bones. It was maintained through systematic terror, and a significant part of that terror specifically involved the ritualistic destruction of powerful women, the transformation of queens into trophies, the public demonstration that no matter how high one ascended, no matter divine one's lineage, Rome could reduce you to absolute nothingness. And what is most profoundly disturbing is that this is not merely ancient history, irrelevant to the present. The mechanisms persist.
The instinct to transform defeated enemies into a spectacle, to extract public humiliation as a means of demonstrating power, to use the bodies of women as symbolic battlegrounds, all of this endures, albeit in different, perhaps more subtle, more recognizable forms. When political leaders are dragged through the media, when scandals are meticulously orchestrated for maximum dramatic impact, when defeats are transformed into mass entertainment, we are witnessing echoes of the Roman triumph. The technology has changed, the methods have evolved, but the underlying principle, the idea that power is most effectively demonstrated through the public destruction of another's dignity, that principle has never truly died. Rome fell, yet its chilling logic survived. As the historian Carlo Ginzburg, a profound scholar of power mechanisms and social control, wrote, "History is not only what happened, but how what happened continues to happen in different forms."
Rome taught us that domination is not merely a matter of physical force. It is a matter of theater, of narrative, of ritual. It is about compelling the dominated to participate in their own humiliation, to implicitly thank their oppressors for it, to internalize it until it becomes a part of their very identity. The captured queens who were kept alive, who became client queens, who raised children to serve Rome, they were not spared out of mercy. They were spared because their continued existence served Roman interests far better than their deaths ever could. They became living propaganda, walking demonstrations that even the most powerful had no choice but to bow. And we, 2000 years later, are still grappling with the meaning of this. We are still contending with the consequences of a system that elevated ritualistic cruelty to the level of an art form, that made human suffering a civil sacrament, that transformed the destruction of entire cultures into family entertainment.
History books prefer to focus on the aqueducts and the roads. They prefer to discuss Roman law and Stoic philosophy. But for every kilometer of paved road, there were countless rows of slaves working themselves to death. For every aqueduct channeling fresh water to Rome, there were entire cities whose resources had been brutally plundered. And for every philosophical treatise on virtue and human dignity, there were queens being dragged in chains while the crowd roared its approval. This is the uncomfortable truth that Rome attempted to gloss over, that subsequent historians sought to soften, that our own educators prefer not to emphasize too heavily. Because if we look too closely, if we truly absorb what was done and why, it becomes impossible to maintain the comfortable narrative of Rome as the simple cradle of civilization. Rome was many things. It was a center of innovation, of art, of philosophy.
But it was also a machine of domination, an industrialized system of humiliation, an empire built upon the premise that some human beings were intrinsically superior to others, and that this superiority needed to be constantly demonstrated through the ritual degradation of the inferior. The captured queens understood this better than anyone. They, who had governed, who had made decisions of life and death, who had been worshipped as divinities, were forced to confront the stark reality that all of that was contingent. It depended on military might. It depended on geography. It depended on sheer luck. And when luck ran out, when the legions arrived, there was nothing their former status could do to protect them. On the contrary, their exalted status guaranteed that their fall would be more spectacular, more public, more complete. Rome did not merely want to win, it wanted the victory to be unforgettable.
It wanted future generations to look back and think, it's not worth resisting. Look what happened to those who tried. And for centuries, this strategy worked perfectly. Kingdom after kingdom surrendered without a fight. Leader after leader accepted client status rather than risk capture and humiliation. The terror of the triumph, the chilling memory of what happened to captured queens, all of this became a diplomatic tool as effective as any legion. Rome did not need to conquer everyone militarily. The threat was sufficient. The memory was sufficient. The stories were sufficient. But eventually, like all empires, Rome fell. Not because of virtue or cosmic justice, but due to simple systemic overload. An empire cannot expand indefinitely, cannot maintain absolute domination over increasingly vast and diverse populations forever.
The cracks inevitably appear. The borders become impossible to defend. The costs exceed the profits. And slowly, painfully, the empire that seemed eternal begins to crumble. When the barbarians finally sacked Rome in 410 CE, when the very streets that had witnessed so many triumphs were themselves invaded by foreign armies, there was a terrible symmetry to it. What Rome had done to so many others was finally done to Rome. The same tactics, the same humiliation, the same terror. And the Roman citizens, accustomed to being spectators of others' suffering, discovered what it was like to be on the other side. But this poetic justice arrived centuries too late for the queens who had died long before, too late for Arsinoe, stumbling under golden chains, too late for Cleopatra Selene, marching at 10 years old behind effigies of her dead mother, too late for Zenobia, bearing chains so she could barely walk.
Too late for all those whose names were never recorded, whose stories never survived, who died in the Mamertine without anyone caring enough to preserve their last words. They were consumed by the machine. Their lives, their identities, their dignities, everything was ground down and transformed into fuel for the glory of Rome. And after the machine consumed them, it simply continued operating, seeking new victims, new kingdoms to conquer, new queens to capture. This is the legacy that rarely appears in films about gladiators or documentaries about Roman engineering. This is the dark underside of civilization, the path we prefer to forget because it forces us aspects of that civilization truly deserve to be celebrated. When we admire Roman efficiency, we are admiring an efficiency that included industrialized systems of humiliation.
When we praise Roman organization, we are praising an organization that coordinated spectacles of human suffering with the same precision it built aqueducts. Everything was interconnected. The same mindset that created magnificent infrastructure also created theaters of cruelty. The same genius for logistics that moved legions thousands of miles also orchestrated processions of humiliation that lasted for agonizing hours. Rome was all of this, simultaneously, and we, its cultural heirs, must confront this totality if we genuinely wish to understand what it means to build a civilization. The captured queens can no longer speak for themselves. Their cries were silenced millennia ago. Their stories were filtered through Roman writers who viewed their destruction as natural and necessary, as part of the correct order of the universe.
But if we listen closely, if we read between the lines, if we pay attention to the details that ancient historians casually included, without perhaps perceiving their full moral significance, we can still reconstruct something of their experiences. We can still honor their memories by recognizing what was done to them, by naming it for what it was, refusing to romanticize or excuse or contextualize until the cruelty disappears under layers of academic rationalization. They were tortured, they were humiliated, they were transformed into objects, they were stripped of everything that made them human, and then either forced to continue living as empty husks or killed in silence after having served their purpose as trophies. And all of this was done not by monsters, not by individual sadists, but by a system, by a civilization, by people who genuinely saw themselves as morally superior, as bearers of light and reason to barbaric peoples. This is the most disturbing part.
Rome genuinely believed it was doing what was right. It believed its civilizing mission justified any method. And this logic did not die with Rome. It is present in every imperial justification, in every rationalization of conquest, in every instance where suffering is described as necessary for some greater good. The words change, the ideologies shift, but the underlying structure remains. The powerful always find reasons why their violence is different, necessary, civilized. The weak are always described as needing to be tamed, educated, incorporated. And when the weak resist, when queens take up arms and lead rebellions, the punishment must be exemplary. It must be so severe that no one else ever contemplates trying. Have these horrors truly been relegated to the past? Or have they merely changed form, becoming more subtle, more legally defended, more technologically sophisticated?
When leaders of defeated nations are tried by tribunals of the victors, broadcast globally, transformed into media spectacles, are we not witnessing modern versions of the triumph? When refugees from wars they did not cause are confined to camps, stripped of dignity, reduced to statistics and administrative problems, are we not seeing the same systematic dehumanization? And when powerful women in any field are brought down, not just with legitimate criticism, but with coordinated humiliation, with the deliberate destruction of their reputation and identity, are we not seeing echoes of the captured queens?
Rome gave us much, but it also bequeathed us a model of domination so effective that we still operate under its shadow. And perhaps it is time we finally look directly into that shadow, recognize it for what it is, stop hiding behind aqueducts and philosophy, and ask ourselves what we truly wish to inherit from Rome.
Its achievements in engineering and law, or its methods of subjugation and humiliation? Can we have one without the other, or is everything so intertwined that separating the admirable from the horrifying is impossible? These are questions without easy answers, but they are questions that absolutely must be asked. Because as long as we fail to confront honestly what Rome did, as long as we continue to romanticize the empire and forget its victims, we remain complicit in its insidious logic. And that logic still operates, still destroys, still transforms human beings into trophies, still celebrates domination as a virtue, still finds ways to make suffering appear not just acceptable, but necessary and even noble. The captured queens deserve to be remembered, not as footnotes in stories about great generals, but as victims of a system that consciously chose cruelty as a tool of the state.
And we deserve to confront what that choice reveals about the nature of power, about the foundations of the civilization we claim to admire, and about who we become when we decide that some suffering is acceptable in the name of some greater perceived grandeur. What do you think about this? About the price civilizations are willing to make others pay?